Waiting in a long queue for over 2 days to charge gasoline? Walking 3 miles to get the only meal of the day? Or living in pitch black darkness due to chronic blackouts are the lives Sri Lankans had to endure every day. Meanwhile, on the other side, a corrupt family clan and high government officials live surrounded by luxury, power, and comfort. The same officials took the entire country's economy to an imminent collapse with a massive $51 billion defaulted debt and a humanitarian crisis that resulted in millions of Sri Lankans storming the president's official palace asking for food, fuel, and medicine. Let's dive deep into what's going on with Sri Lanka. But first, subscribe to Market Magnets and click the notification bell not to miss any of our following videos. In July, several photos and videos all over the internet went viral when an immense crew stormed the official presidential home. And it was far from just a home. This was an immense palace full of luxury and extravagance. A residential house of pure opulence clearly showed that something wasn't right with the Sri Lanka government. In those viral videos, the world saw many protesters dive into the immense swimming pool of the government palace. Still, months before that, the media coverage of people enduring hours-long blackouts and long queues wasn't the same. For the past months, long before the protests started, millions of citizens were waiting in long lines for days to buy essentials, while a small number of elite politicians and millionaires, backed by the ex-president, indulged in a luxurious lifestyle. To see how a hard-working Sri Lankan is really doing, it is enough to see photos of taxi drivers pushing their vehicles in a long line that could last up to 2 days under the excruciating heat of the Sri Lankan sun. The situation is the same all over the country due to a frustrating oil crisis. Many parents have to queue up for days only to get fuel so that they can keep working and supporting their families. Dozens of new community kitchens have popped up in recent months, all collapsing when crowds of starved citizens started waiting in long lines hoping that the food won't run out. People are desperate. One family even pushed another mother in a wheelchair 3 miles to get the only meal of the day. This economic collapse is so deep that it will result in a humanitarian crisis, thanks to the irresponsible policies set by high-ranking officials. Decades of corruption, mismanagement, and rampant inflation led to the Sri Lanka we see today, a country running out of foreign reserves, with a devalued currency, and an impoverished population, essentially with no money left on the central bank. So, with no more money for the nation to spend, how can an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean pay for its much-needed imports? Lack of funds and a bleeding central bank explain the massive daily shortages people are dealing with. All this mess comes from a long history of several missteps in policymaking. High government officials spend more than they earn without caring about the country's economic future. And as the last piece of the puzzle, ex-president Gotabaya, friends, and family were in charge of ruining Sri Lanka in the previous decades. Sri Lankan protesters blame them for systematically mismanaging funds due to incompetence or greed. It's no secret that all that capital went directly into the presidential palace once you take a closer look at the wealthy lifestyle of a 70-year dynasty. It's a story of fiscal imprudence, unsustainable exchange rate policy, chronic corruption. Those flaws are in every area of Sri Lanka's political sphere and are responsible for a system on the verge of collapse. Overlooking Sri Lanka's many bad policies, the country imports more than it exports, and that trade deficit means it spends more than it earns. On top of that, it's plagued by a severe budget deficit, a perfect storm that resulted in over 500,000 people falling into the poverty line in the last few months. And instead of narrowing an uncontrollable deficit, shrinking it, the president expanded its debt, leading to 111% of its GDP. Gotabaya borrowed from governments and agencies at an uncontrollable rate. In 2019, the international community warned the ex-fleeing president of this unbalanced problem at the time. And Gotabaya's response? During his presidential campaign in 2019, he exacerbated the problem by proposing tax cuts. With that reckless promise, people voted for him in disputed elections. 52% of voters chose him. When the president reduced the number of taxpayers by 1 million, he took away necessary funds for the government. There are 2 reasons why the tax cut turned out to be so dangerous for Sri Lanka. Before the tax cut, The economy suffered from massive tax evasion in a country where taxes already contributed only 2% of the GDP. Sri Lanka went from a revenue of 9.1% in 2020 to payment of only 7.7% in 2021. And among countries in the region, Sri Lanka has a considerably low tax-to-GDP ratio. The last thing it needed was more tax cuts. Foreign investors couldn't believe that a country with bleeding reserves could promise such an irresponsible fiscal policy. As a result, the government lost credibility, leading investors to avoid the instability of Sri Lanka. The doors of international markets shut entirely when the three central rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch, downgraded the Sri Lanka bonds to junk status, which means near default levels. Such a massive berating only helped to speed up the imminent collapse. After that, nobody wanted to lend money to Sri Lanka. The country was running out of resources, and asking for a loan with a GDP of 111% was off the table. In early 2019, the Sri Lanka Central Bank had about $2 billion in foreign reserves and approximately $9 billion to pay up in the upcoming months. Nobody in their right mind would pay a government that could default on its debt at any time. The government can no longer seek help from international markets to borrow money, a scheme they frequently use to survive a couple of months. They have been paying old debt with new debt for decades, which has become a giant unpayable snowball. Without international capital, a country's economy can't survive long. So Sri Lanka depended upon their shrinking foreign reserves to stabilize its local currency and economy, something that it still can't achieve. 2 years after Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt, in the spring of 2021, the go-to-buy a house of cards started to crumble with one more ridiculous policy. They banned all chemical fertilizers while millions of people were looking for food in community kitchens. One of the last poor decisions from government officials was the ban on chemical fertilizers. Agricultural production, equal to 8% of Sri Lanka's GDP, had also fallen, and the total revenue fell dramatically. There wasn't a dime coming in. Sri Lanka was in an unprecedented shortage of money, and that ban on fertilizers to save foreign reserves backfired. Rice production went down by 50% months later, and for the first time in years, Sri Lanka had to import rice, adding another expense to the already weak foreign reserves. The president also had another close partner, maybe even too close: China. A Chinese partnership only worsened the fact that Sri Lanka had a money shortage. And things started to crumble fast when the Easter bombings, where 269 people died in churches and luxury hotels, scared off European tourists, and the health crisis in China closed the sector for good. In a few months, 13% of their GDP was gone. In 2018, they received 2.2 million tourists. In 2020, only 170,000. And with an irresponsible tax reduction in the middle of an immense health and tourism crisis, the situation only worsened. The government was desperate and asked for money from its neighbors. In 2021, Bangladesh loaned $200 million, and India lent $500 million a couple of months later to an economy on the verge of collapsing. Sri Lanka went from a pro-market vision in the 2010s, when it had one of the fastest-growing economies worldwide, to taking a 180-degree turn into a welfare state with corrupt officials. Thousands were starving when the president invested in infrastructure and expanded its military, promoting policies that didn't align with people's emergency needs. In March, Gotabaya devalued the Sri Lanka rupee by up to 15%. Many saw a devalued currency eating away at their salaries, and the situation only worsened when prices kept rising, with so many essential supplies non-existent on the island. With all those government policies, their currency in 2020 fell by 40%. Inflation is over 50%, and some analysts suggest it could go well over 80%. Food prices were touching the 3 digits. The situation left over 6.3 million people hungry and malnourished every day. Sri Lanka has been hit with all the significant cataclysms that could exist: spiking prices, an alarming reduction in crop yields, and a lack of state funds for crucial supplies, making it almost impossible for the nation to import fuel, a situation that produced daily power cuts and long queues in gas stations. Everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong in Sri Lanka. There are many reasons to believe that this clan has a lot of responsibility in the country's economic and humanitarian collapse. The family clan has been in powerful political spheres for over 70 years. Mahinda Rajapaksa was president from 2005 to 2015, and his younger brother Gotabaya from 2019 until he was forced to resign on massive protests. Once they entered those palace doors, Sri Lankans immediately realized where all the money went. The country's 8th president resigned and fled on a military jet, but the Sri Lankan crisis keeps hurting the island. And the new president in charge has many contacts and similarities with Gotabaya and the powerful Rajapaksa dynasty. The nation needs stability so that its old dynasty doesn't come back. Is the Sri Lanka crisis an opportunity to leave behind these 70 years of rule by one single family? Or does the corrupted dynasty still have the country on its hooks?